remembered. The low islands, too, this time merging with the evening clouds. And in the middle of them all, its summit seemingly lipped with a curious orange fire, rose the pyramid shape of the one active remnant part of the great disaster. As I looked through my glasses, so I could clearly see that the orange was indeed fire, and that from it rose smoke just as before, only this time a tumble of black billows that towered straight up into the windless late evening sky. But there was one obvious difference. The pyramid, which I now knew to be locally called Anak, which is the Malay word for the child of what had once existed there before the great eruption, seemed this time somehow bigger, sturdier, much taller than I had remembered. I blinked hard, looked again. I measured it as best I could against the big peak to the left, trying to recall where the smaller mountain had stood in relation to that cliff wall. It was higher up now, surely. Yes, there was no doubt. Memory does play tricks in situations like this, to be sure. But as I stared long and hard, I became ever more certain. The volcano, the child of Krakatoa, had grown very much larger during the 25 years that I'd been away. When I got back to the maps, I checked, and I could see in short order that the modern surveys all agreed. The small island mountain, which had been born out of the sea 40-odd years after the very explosion that destroyed and vaporized its parent, was now itself growing fast, thrusting upwards at an extraordinary rate. By looking at the old charts and maps that had been published down the years since the last week of June 1927, when it was first seen above the waves, it was possible to calculate that it had been growing taller, fairly steadily, at an average rate of about 5 inches a week. True, there had been some fits and starts, a lava flow here, a wild eruption there, but generally Anak Krakatoa had enlarged itself by 20 or so inches each month since 1927. Every year since its birth it had become higher by 20 feet, and somewhere near 40 feet wider, and if this was indeed so still, I checked my figures once again, then it meant that my mountain was not simply taller, it was fully 500 feet taller than when I'd last seen it. Which is why this sturdy stripling of a volcano has captivated me ever since. It's a volcano that absolutely and very visibly refuses to die. It's a volcano that seems to me to possess that wonderfully seductive combination of being both beautiful and dangerous, unpredictable and unforgettable. And more, though what happened in its former life was unutterably terrible, the realities of geology and seismicity and the peculiar tectonics of Java and Sumatra make sure that what happened back then will without a doubt one day repeat itself in precisely the same way. No one can be sure exactly when. Probably it'll be very many years that is, before anything will befall the world that could possibly be as dreadful as what took place during the historic paroxysmal moment which reached its extraordinary climax at exactly 2 minutes past 10 on the morning of Monday, the 27th of August, 1883. The explosion itself was terrific, a monstrous thing that still attracts an endless procession of superlatives. It was the greatest detonation, the loudest sound, the most devastating volcanic event in modern recorded human history, and it killed more than 36,000 people. Geological evidence from around the world admits of a number of bigger and more devastating volcanoes, true. Krakatoa is reckoned today to be only the 5th most explosive in the planet's certain geological history. Mounts Toba and Tambora in the East Indies, Taupo in New Zealand and Katmai in Alaska are all thought to have been very much larger, at least in terms of the amount of material they hurled into the sky and the height to which all that material is thought to have soared. But these were all eruptions quite lost to antiquity, with rather little direct effect on human society. When Krakatoa exploded, it was 1883, and the world was a profoundly different place. Sophisticated human beings were on hand to see this volcano's convulsions. They were able to investigate the event, and they were able to attempt to understand the processes that had caused such dreadful violence. And yet, as it happens, their observations, painstaking and precise as science demanded, collided head-on with a most discomforting reality, that while in 1883 the world was becoming ever more scientifically advanced, it was in part because of these same advances that its people found themselves in a strangely febrile and delicately balanced condition, which an event like Krakatoa did much to unsettle. The communications technology of the time, for example, the advances of telegraphy, the building of undersea cables, the flourishing of news agencies, ensured that the world's more advanced peoples learned about the eruption within moments of it happening. But at the same time, the limited and only slowly unfolding geological knowledge then to hand didn't give the audience a sufficient explanation of the events that might soothe their fears about all that they were learning. Hearing of the event quite baffled people thousands of miles away from where it happened, and it left faraway populations bewildered, and in some cases more than a little frightened. Moreover, religious dogma still held a powerful grip on millions, even in societies whose scientific understanding was advancing so rapidly. Tribal ancestors might have explained away an eruption like Krakatoa's. It was simply a matter of the gods being angry. But the luxury of such a facile explanation was not available to the more modern people of 1883, whose growing sophistication meant that they both knew so much about an event like this, and yet at the same time actually knew so little. They had sufficient knowledge of the facts, the news agencies saw to that, but it was a knowledge coupled with an insufficiency of understanding. Many people worried in consequence that the eruption of Krakatoa meant something infinitely more dreadful than it did, that their world was being torn asunder, and perhaps even, as the Bible had foretold, was coming to an end. Fretful and fascinated people around the world, in cities as distant from Java and from each other as Boston and Bombay and Brisbane, all came to know of the event in an instant, and they did so quite simply because this was the world's first major catastrophe to have taken place in the aftermath of the invention of the submarine telegraph. The newspapers were full of it. The descriptions of the happenings made all the more enthralling because they were so perfectly up to date. Words and phrases that had hitherto been utterly unfamiliar, Java, Sumatra, the Sunda Strait, Batavia, became in one mighty flash of eruptive light part of the common currency of all. And in learning of these places and of the terrible events that occurred there, so the world's people became suddenly part of a new brotherhood of knowledge. In a sense, it was that day in August 1883 that the modern phenomenon known as the Global Village was born, in part through the agency of this enormous explosion. The word Krakatoa, despite being a word misspelled and mangled by the imperfect arts of Victorian telegraphy and journalism, became, in one awful, ear-splitting moment, a by-name for cataclysm, paroxysm, death, and disaster. And the disaster left a trail of practical consequences, political, religious, social, economic, psychological, scientific consequences among them. Even today, curious and chilling echoes of those consequences are still faintly and worryingly discernible, both in Java and around the globe. In all sorts of other observable ways, the impact of Krakatoa on the world's consciousness was profound, and immensely more so than in the case of the eruption of the four technically greater volcanoes of earlier times. Krakatoa had an impact on climate, for example. The airborne debris hurled into the skies lowered the planet's temperature. It changed the appearance of the entire world's skies. It set barometers and tide meters to flailing wildly thousands of miles away. It panicked American firefighters into battling what they thought were raging infernos, but were in truth violent sunsets caused by the roiling clouds of Krakatoan dust. Today, unlike yesterday, and because of all the painstaking and precise work that was begun in the immediate aftermath of the eruption, we know just why it was that Krakatoa erupted, and we now understand only too well the nature of the forces that caused it. An entirely new science has come along to pare away the old and myth-making mysteries of the event, and to render this volcano, and indeed all other volcanoes, readily explicable. Nowadays, from a palm plantation high on a green hillside, Krakatoa looks on most days peaceful and serene, with just a thin column of white or grey or on occasion black smoke easing up from the summit. But looks are deceptive. All the while, the child mountain is growing steadily and rapidly as the elemental fires that created the world rage deep inside. Chapter 1. An Island with a Pointed Mountain. Though we think first of Java as an eponym for coffee, or to some people today a computer language, it is in fact the trading of aromatic tropical spices on which the fortunes of the great island's colonizers and western discoverers were first founded. and initially supreme among those spices was the one rather ordinary variety that remains the most widely used today, pepper. Piper nigrum, Syzygium aromaticum, and Myristica fragrans, pepper, clove, and nutmeg, were the original holy trinity of the Asian spice trade. Each was familiar to and used by the ancients. 200 years before the birth of Christ, for instance, the Chinese of the Han dynasty demanded that their courtiers address their emperors only when their breath had been sweetened with a mouthful of Javanese cloves, the odoriferous pistils, as they were later more widely known. There is some vague evidence that Roman priests may have employed nutmeg as an incense. It was definitely in use as a flavouring in 9th century Constantinople, since the terrifyingly orthodox Saint Theodore the Studite, the scourge of the image-smashing iconoclasts, famously allowed his monks to sprinkle it on the peas pudding they were obliged to eat on days when monastery meat was forbidden. And in Elizabethan times, a nutmeg pomander was an essential for keeping foul ailments at bay. The notion that nutmeg could ward off the plague survived longer than many another old wives' tale. Pepper, though, was of infinitely more moment to the ancients than merely to be used as a topping, a nostrum, or a cachou. The Romans used it in abundance. Gibbon wrote of pepper being a favourite ingredient of the most expensive Roman cookery, and added his authority to the widely held idea that Alaric, the rambunctious king of the Visigoths, had demanded more than a ton of it from the Romans as ransom when he laid siege to the city in 410 AD. The aureus and the denarius, the gold and silver currency coins of the empire, became the preferred currency of the spice route, and the Indian pepper merchants of Cochin and Malacca and the ports of southern Ceylon were said to be impressed that the denomination of coins was marked by the number engraved upon them and not their size. However they may have been denominated, an enormous number of them must have been paid out. Pepper was so precious and costly, and so much in demand, that the cost of it all had Pliny the Elder fulminating. There was no year in which India, and by this he meant the Indies, since pepper traded came both from the Malabar coast and from western Java, does not drain the Roman Empire of 50 million sesterces. So dearly, he added dryly, do we pay for our luxury and our women. There is a pleasing symmetry about Pliny's involvement in this part of the story of Krakatoa, even if he appears only in a walk-on role. Although this rich and well-connected former soldier, he was a cavalry officer in Roman Germany, happily took on a variety of official duties on behalf of his emperors, Pliny was above all else a naturalist. He was a savant, or a student, as he once famously put it, of the nature of things, that is, life. His reputation is based largely on his 37-volume Natural History, an immense masterpiece in which, among countless other delights, is the first use of the word from which we derive today's encyclopedia. It was during the late summer of 79 AD, while he was pursuing his official task of investigating piracy in the Bay of Naples, that he was persuaded to explore a peculiar cloud formation that appeared to be coming from the summit of the local mountain Vesuvius. He was duly rowed ashore, visited a local village to calm the panicked inhabitants, and was promptly caught up in a massive eruption. He died of asphyxiation by volcanic gases on the 24th of August, leaving behind him a vast reputation, and as memorial a single word in the lexicon of modern volcanology, Plinian. A Plinian eruption is now defined as an almighty, catastrophic, explosive eruption that all but destroys the entire volcano from which it emanates. And the most devastating Plinian event of the modern era occurred 1,804 years almost to the day after Pliny the Elder's death at Krakatoa. Pepper has a confused reputation. There's no truth, for example, in the widely held belief that it was once used to hide the taste of putrefying meat. This charming thought perhaps derives from the equally delightful notion, still recognized by druggists today, that pepper can be used as a carminative, a potion that expels entrapped flatulence. But it was very much used as a preservative, and more commonly still as a seasoning. By the 10th century it was being imported into England. The Guild of Pepperers, one of the most ancients of the London city guilds, was established at least before 1180, which was when the body was first recorded, as being in court for some minor infraction. By 1328 the guild had been formally registered as an importer of spices in large or gross amounts. Its members were called grossarii, from which comes the modern word gross.